Good to see you.
Mike, great to see you.
During the pandemic, we spoke socially distanced at our offices in Washington, D.C. Kyle is the director of the Peacebuilding and Transforming Extremism practice at Equal Access International. That's a nonprofit that works in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. He spent 15 years working in the field of countering violent extremism, or CVE.
I've heard you describing yourself as an empowerment coach. So talk to me about the individual lives that where you've seen a change.
Sure. So empowerment is this overused concept that I think for me boils down to two things. It's the ability to know what you want your life to look like and the ability to have the tools to create that life, okay? And in our work, it's embedded and infused within everything we do. The reason is simple. I'm going to take it back to this sort of the lens of the conversation around violent extremism. Violent extremism as a concept or a construct is empowered because it's based on vision. It's based on compelling, triggering narratives of grievances and opportunities that people see themselves as part of, right? That is inherently empowering. So VE is an empowered space. CVE, countering violent extremism, this work to address it, is an impoverished space. Why do I say that? Because CVE, countering violent extremism, counterterrorism work, lacks vision. It lacks vision. If you don't have a compelling alternative vision for these individuals who are choosing to protest on January 6th or to challenge the governments around the Lake Chad Basin in Nigeria and the Sahel or Somalia or Afghanistan, if they don't have a compelling vision, they're not going to be motivated to be part of it. And so what I do in my empowerment work is it's really about moving the conversation from where we are to where we want to go and how we get there. And so it's all about cultivating vision in communities. And so what do I mean by this? Let me give a tangible example. In Nigeria, we have programs, we have drama and talk show radio programs. We also have television programs, and they reach 50, 60 million people a week. And so huge audiences. In Nigeria, when I talk about empowerment, we're starting with a drug abuse and addiction problem, which is real, and it's shown to link to criminality and to violent extremism and to gang activity. And so we're trying to think, how can we affect change around this particular social problem and move it in a different direction? And so the answer for us was, we want to move it from a criminal justice perspective to a public health perspective. So on our radio programs, talk about addiction, talk about public health resources, talk about rehabilitation. Don't criminalize users, right? It's a health issue. It could be a mental health issue. It could be related to poverty and other grievances. And then so fundamentally getting people to think differently is about changing the attitudes. And then the social norms is moving people into, okay, I have somebody, I know somebody, let me find the right services. If they don't exist, let's create the services or create the networks. And so empowerment is about moving us from a pathological mindset where we're hyper-focused on a problem to a vision-based mindset where we're looking at how we can create what we want things to look like.
Equal Access International was started 20 years ago with funding from the United Nations and foundations. Their approach: use media, like educational TV shows, to engage communities and transform violent extremism.
Let's step back a little bit. Let's take the process of radicalization as a construct. I think in our work, we look at radicalization as a form of empowerment. Okay, these are two parallel processes of self-actualization, of me becoming my true self. But in a society where there aren't the protected opportunities or outlets or spaces for me to do that peacefully or nonviolently, a lot of times people choose to do it through coercion or violence. And so I think the first thing we have to do when we're looking at whether it's Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their whole vast network of affiliated groups is it's not about condoning violence. How many countries had citizens fighting in Iraq and Syria? Over 110. Why? Is it because they were all devout Muslims who wanted an Islamic state? I would argue no. I would argue it's because there was a compelling vision for social change in which they saw themselves. So it was inclusive and big enough as a vision that individuals from 110 countries, more than half the world, fled, risked their life for a cause. So that's also an asset. There's a commitment to a cause. There's leadership abilities. They're taking agency over their lives, which is what we want. We want people to take agency, but they're not finding those pathways in their communities, whether it's Somalia or Nigeria or the Sahel or Afghanistan, right? They're finding it through other paths that are often, espousing violence.
One of the things I find interesting about your work, and I'm curious how you approach this. I remember interviewing a woman from Kampala years ago who went to work for an NGO, and she would go to these meetings. There were a lot of really smart people that looked a lot like you who would say, oh, this worked in Mozambique, and I think we can transition it here, and it's going to work here. But no one ever included her in the conversation, and she would sit there and think, this isn't going to work here. You're great at talking, but the listening piece, I think, is really important in what you do. Can you talk to us about that and the importance of it, and getting the buy-in, and also getting the knowledge base there?
Thanks, Mike. This is a great question. I assume this person was Ugandan?
Yes.
So I'll say first, in terms of our approach, 15 countries, all of our country directors, all of our staff are locals. And so I think the problem is that you often get, whether it's pressure from a donor or whether it's just the culture of aid, right? We have to admit that aid is a neo-colonial industry. And so one thing we have to do is decolonize that industry, unlearn some of the things. I mean, there's a reason why humanitarianism as a field emerged 150 years ago. There's a reason after World War II, this industry of aid and peacekeeping, and the UN was founded. And again, who are the power brokers that are shaping the agenda? Where's the funding come from? How does it reflect back on their own strategic self-interest? And so this is a hard thing to do, because I think our model, which again is having local leadership, is a plus and a minus. Obviously, it's great for sustainability. It's great for all the points of, this colleague would say, it's like, we do robust research every time we go in, deep stakeholder engagement, consultations. We have content advisory groups for our media work. We have listening discussion groups for radio programs that give us iterative, real-time feedback. And so we're not just throwing stuff out. It's designed by them. They're advising in sort of test phase, and then they're giving us feedback on dramas, on TV shows, on women's empowerment, cooking programs, anything, so we know where it's landing and how it's landing. We're also doing that in terms of going all the way out to extremist groups and finding ways of getting members of extremist groups to engage with our content, because one of the limits, to a separate topic, one of the challenges of our work is we have something called the Material Support Clause. And so you cannot directly train or build capacity or engage with a terrorist organization or any individual that is on a terrorist list, right? And this is, for some reason, makes sense. For others, it doesn't, right? If I went to Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras and I was going to do a program that was working with gang members, but you said talk to everybody but the gang members, you would think I'm crazy. You would think, well, how are you going to fix this problem if you're not doing an inclusive project where you're engaging the gang? That's exactly what we're doing when it comes to all of these actors. We're told no negotiation with terrorists. I can't train these folks. And so us, as a media-driven organization, we often get around that by creating media that we can push to people and then find ways of getting feedback to see, are they defecting from this group because they're listening to our program? Are they more likely to see the humanity in the victims and not target them? Right? Are host communities more likely to welcome these individuals back if they defect, or are they going to be stigmatized and just go back to the bush and keep fighting? Right? And so we have data on all of these to show that we're actually making a change in people's attitudes and behaviors. But it's only possible because you have to be inclusive of those individuals on the ground, like this woman in Uganda, to help you design and build off of local expertise, what works, right? And then the USAID has an entire agenda around this called the Journey to Self-Reliance, which is about localizing and making sustainable this work. And it has to be done in line with that, not just because it's a good talking point, because it's what it works best.
So Kyle, when I think about you, I know a little bit about Arkansas. Mountain Home, I think, is a population of like 12,000, maybe a little bit more. How does a guy like that end up in this kind of work?
That's a good question. Yeah, it was 5,000 when I was a kid. Good parents. I think kind of a desire to see something bigger. I mean, I think there are sort of two answers to this question. One is the personal, one is the professional. The personal side is I was a rough kid. I was exposed to different kinds of violence. There were gang violence, there was other things where I saw young people, including myself, that didn't have the opportunities and the outlets to get into the positive things, the healthy behaviors, the healthy relationships. And so when I got into the work later in life and I look back at myself and who I was, despite being a white privileged man, middle class, I wanted to do something different for people like me, for people like anybody. The other is a lot of my work. So I went to high school in Mexico City. I went to college in Brazil and Morocco, bounced around a lot. Like I said, the Peace Corps, worked for the UN, did a bunch of things. But I think early in life, I was able to do some research on UN peacekeeping missions. I lived in the Western Sahara in Morocco, was looking at the political mission and how it could better serve the people and create an outcome that created more inclusion for that particular conflict. I went to work with the UN in a peacekeeping mission, and I just got very interested in how we manage or mismanage conflict. I think personally, almost spiritually, I think conflict is a natural part of life, and it seems too often that we fundamentally misunderstand and mismanage it. We don't always have the tools to understand how, whether it's between two people or within ourselves or between two groups or countries, conflict can be this great engine for social change. And I wanted to develop the tools and the processes that helped people channel that energy embedded within conflict for more positive outcomes that didn't lead to violence. So I mean, that's the real answer.
And you think your own personal background kind of fueled who you are today?
Absolutely.
And gives you a different perspective perhaps than somebody who doesn't have that kind of background?
Absolutely. I mean, so much of my work is standing in front of a group of former child soldiers, of gang members, of at-risk individuals, drug addicted, former addicts, anything. And so having been through enough of what I've been through, despite looking like I look, which is again, as a white male of a certain background, I think it gives me a sense of confidence and credibility when I'm talking to these individuals about going through hardship and about turning your life around and how you do that, what that process of growth and healing and transformation is. I'm not just speaking theoretically.
Since the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the U.S. set in motion a counter-terror agenda that has led to what's been called a forever war in Afghanistan. In the past 2 decades, the human cost of the war has been steep. The conflict has claimed the lives of more than 43,000 Afghan civilians, 45,000 Afghan soldiers and police, 42,000 Taliban fighters, and 2,300 American soldiers.
We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What is the legacy of the 20 years?
I think the greatest failure that we have as states is that we fail to acknowledge our contribution and our responsibility to some of these problems. We want to externalize the problem and the solution by looking at how we can sort of move pieces in the chessboard that are often outside of our control, through different strategic methods, whether it's use of force or soft power. And the soft power is where I come in. This entire field of countering violent extremism is really an outgrowth of the field of counterterrorism and what we called counterinsurgency operations. These really emerged after September 11th, right? But it was a heavy enemy-centric approach that we prioritized in the early years after 9/11. I think what we learned specifically in Afghanistan was we need a population-centric, a civilian-centric approach to building stabilization and building stable states. And it couldn't just be focused on defeating enemies, because with this particular type of threat, violent extremism or terrorism, it's only going to create more problems. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan in 2002, living an hour and a half from the border of Afghanistan in Iran. And I was there as an educator, as training teachers, doing community work, and we went to war with Afghanistan. Again, an hour and a half, 2 hours away. I was like, whoa, and somehow I managed to finish a 2.5-year tenure in the Peace Corps. 2003, March, the US launched a war against Iraq. And then everybody looked at us, again, just sort of across the border. After Iran, you get Iraq. And so Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi, the president at the time, everybody thought Turkmenistan was next. They have energy, they have a dictator, an autocratic leader. Everybody thought from that day forward, I was a spy. I would be, taken in by intelligence agents to talk about, why are you really here? Do you have satellite equipment? I'm like, no, I'm a teacher. I have a cell phone. I have a computer. It fundamentally, impacts the credibility of actors like us, whether I'm a development actor, the Peace Corps, anybody else. We are the front line at the individual level, building the credibility and reputation of the US. I was doing that for years in Turkmenistan. My example is simply the act of invading Iraq undermined everything I did, right? In one attack, unannounced, which most people agree was a mistake, right, to invade Iraq, and everything that spiraled since. But it's just huge consequences, right? When you talk about the Muslim ban or ban on other countries, I work in half those countries. And people now saying, oh, I can't visit your country because it's all of these have deep, deep ramifications. And so that trust doesn't get rebuilt quickly. I think Biden, as part of the Obama administration, a huge part of the foreign policy apparatus of this country through the Senate for years, has a ton of credibility. But it's going to be where we invest and what are the successes, because we have complex crises like dealing with transnational terrorism that we still don't have viable solutions for. And it's metastasizing, like I said, it's in Mozambique, it's in Congo now, it's all across Eastern Africa, the Sahel, it's North Africa, it's everywhere. But there's a reason. Go back to the reason why these things exist. What alternative exists in these countries? I mean, one, the grievances are legitimate, right? But what alternative are we as actors driven by soft power, inclusion, equity, and creating new visions for how societies can function? What are we doing to create those and bring in everybody to the table? We don't want to do that. We don't want to talk about that when it comes to, in a peace process, you would bring in a rebel group, you'd bring in an armed group, you'd bring in a gang member, or the leadership of a gang. But we don't do that with extremist groups. And so what option do we have to actually fold them into some sort of future where they all see themselves? It is a challenge.
You've given us a lot to think about, which I know probably keeps you up at night. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.